Chapter 30. Reaction of the Agricultural Revolution on Industry. Creation of the home market for industrial capital. The expropriation and expulsion of the agricultural population, intermittent but renewed again and again, supplied, as we saw, the town industries with a mass of proletarians entirely unconnected with the corporate guilds and unfettered by them, a fortunate circumstance that makes old A. Anderson, not to be confounded with James Anderson, in his History of Commerce believe in the direct intervention of Providence. We must still pause a moment on this element of primitive accumulation. The thinning out of the independent, self-supporting peasants not only brought about the crowding together of the industrial proletariat, in the way that Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, in his Notions de philosophie naturelle, Paris, 1838, explained the condensation of cosmical matter at one place by its rarefaction at another, but in spite of the smaller number of its cultivators, the soil brought forth as much or more produce after as before, because the revolution in the conditions of landed property was accompanied by improved methods of culture, greater cooperation, concentration of the means of production, etc., and because not only were the agricultural wage labourers put on the strain more intensely, a point that Sir James Stewart emphasises, but the field of production on which they worked for themselves became more and more contracted. With the setting free of a part of the agricultural population, therefore, their former means of nourishment were also set free. They were now transformed into material elements of variable capital. The peasant, expropriated and cast adrift, must buy their value in the form of wages from his new master, the industrial capitalist. That which holds good of the means of subsistence holds with the raw materials of industry dependent upon home agriculture. They were transformed into an element of constant capital. Suppose, for example, a part of the Westphalian peasants who at the time of Frederick II all span flax, forcibly expropriated and hunted from the soil, and the other part, that remained, turned into day labourers of large farmers. At the same time arise large establishments for flax spinning and weaving, in which the men set free now work for wages. The flax looks exactly as before, not a fibre of it is changed, but a new social soul has popped into its body. It forms now a part of the constant capital of the master manufacturer. Formerly divided among a number of small producers who cultivated it themselves, and with their families spun it in retail fashion, it is now concentrated in the hand of one capitalist, who sets others to spin and weave it for him. The extra labour expended in flax spinning realised itself formerly in extra income to numerous peasant families, or maybe, in Frederick II's time, in taxes pour le roi de Prusse. It realizes itself now in profit for a few capitalists. The spindles and looms, formerly scattered over the face of the country, are now crowded together in a few great labour barracks, together with the labourers and the raw material. And spindles, looms, raw material are now transformed from means of independent existence for the spinners and weavers into means for commanding them and sucking out of them unpaid labour. Footnote: I will allow you, says the capitalist, to have the honour of serving me on condition that, in return for the pains I take in commanding you, you give me the little that remains to you. J. Rousseau, Discours sur l'économie politique. End of footnote. One does not perceive, when looking at the large manufactories and the large farms, that they have originated from the throwing into one of many small centres of production, and have been built up by the expropriation of many small independent producers. Nevertheless, the popular intuition was not at fault. In the time of Mirabeau, the lion of the Revolution, the great manufactories were still called manufactures réunies, workshops thrown into one, as we speak of fields thrown into one. Says Mirabeau, "We are only paying attention to the grand manufactories in which hundreds of men work under a director, and which are commonly called manufactures réunies. Those where a very large number of labourers work, each separately and on his own account, are hardly considered. They are placed at an infinite distance from the others. This is a great error, as the latter alone make a really important object of national prosperity. The large workshop, manufactures réunies, will enrich prodigiously one or two entrepreneurs, but the labourers will only be journeymen, paid more or less, and will not have any share in the success of the undertaking. In the discrete workshop, manufactures séparées, on the contrary, no one will become rich, but many labourers will be comfortable. The saving and the industrious will be able to amass a little capital, to put by a little for a birth of a child, for an illness, for themselves or their belongings. The number of saving and industrious labourers will increase, because they will see in good conduct, in activity, a means of essentially bettering their condition, and not of obtaining a small rise in wages that can never be of any importance of the future, and whose sole result is to place men in the position to live a little better, but only from day to day. The large workshops, undertakings of certain private persons who pay labourers from day to day to work for their gain, may be able to put these private individuals at their ease, but they will never be an object worth the attention of governments. Discrete workshops, for the most part, combined with cultivation of small holdings, are the only free ones. Footnote: that Mirabeau considers the separate workshops more economical and productive than the combined, and sees in the latter merely artificial exotics under government cultivation, is explained by the position at that time of a great part of the continental manufactures. End of footnote. The expropriation and eviction of a part of the agricultural population not only set free for industrial capital the labourers, their means of subsistence and material for labour, it also created the home market. In fact, the events that transformed the small peasants into wage labourers, and their means of subsistence and of labour into material elements of capital, created at the same time a home market for the latter. Formerly, the peasant family produced the means of subsistence and the raw materials which they themselves, for the most part, consumed. These raw materials and means of subsistence have now become commodities. The large farmer sells them. He finds his market in manufactures. Yarn, linen, coarse woolen stuffs, things whose raw materials had been within the reach of every peasant family, had been spun and woven by it for its own use, were now transformed into articles of manufacture, to which the country districts at once served for markets. The many scattered customers, whom stray artisans until now had found in the numerous small producers working on their own account, concentrate themselves now into one great market provided for by industrial capital. Footnote: 20 pounds of wool, converted unobtrusively into yearly clothing of a labourer's family by its own industry in the intervals of other works, this makes no show. But bring it to market, send it to the factory, thence to the broker, thence to the dealer, and you will have great commercial operations, and nominal capital engaged to the amount of 20 times its value. The working class is thus immersed to support a wretched factory population, a parasitical shopkeeping class, and a fictitious commercial monetary and financial system. David Urquhart. End of footnote. Thus, hand in hand with the expropriation of the self-supporting peasants, with their separation from their means of production, goes the destruction of rural domestic industry, the process of separation between manufacture and agriculture. And only the destruction of rural domestic industry can give the internal market of a country that extension and consistence which the capitalist mode of production requires. Still, the manufacturing period, properly so called, does not succeed in carrying out this transformation radically and completely. It will be remembered that manufacture, properly so called, conquers but partially the domain of national production, and always rests on the handicrafts of the town and the domestic industry of the rural districts as its ultimate basis. If it destroys these in one form, in particular branches at certain points, it calls them up again elsewhere, because it needs them for the preparation of raw material up to a certain point. It produces, therefore, a new class of small villagers who, while following the cultivation of the soil as an accessory calling, find their chief occupation in industrial labour, the products of which they sell to the manufacturers directly or through the medium of merchants. This is one, though not the chief, cause of a phenomenon which, at first, puzzles the student of English history. From the last third of the 15th century, he finds continually complaints, only interrupted at certain intervals, about the encroachment of capitalist farming in the country districts and the progressive destruction of the peasantry. Footnote. Cromwell's time forms an exception. So long as the Republic lasted, the mass of the English people of all grades rose from the degradation into which they had sunk under the Tudors. End of footnote. On the other hand, the student always finds this peasantry turning up again, although in diminished number, and always under worse conditions. The chief reason is, England is at one time chiefly a cultivator of corn, at another chiefly a breeder of cattle in alternate periods, and with these the extent of peasant cultivation fluctuates. Modern industry alone, and finally, supplies, in machinery the lasting basis of capitalist agriculture, expropriates radically the enormous majority of the agricultural population, and completes the separation between agriculture and rural domestic industry, whose roots, spinning and weaving, it tears up. Footnote. Tuckett is aware that the modern woolen industry has sprung, with the introduction of machinery, from manufacture proper and from the destruction of rural and domestic industries. The plough, the yoke, were the invention of gods and the occupation of heroes. Are the loom, the spindle, the distaff of less noble parentage? You sever the distaff and the plough, the spindle and the yoke, and you get factories and poorhouses, credit and panics, two hostile nations, agriculture and commercial. David Urquhart. But now comes Carey and cries out upon England, surely not with unreason, that it is trying to turn every other country into a mere agricultural nation, whose manufacturer is to be England. He pretends that in this way Turkey has been ruined, because the owners and occupants of land have never been permitted by England to strengthen themselves by the formation of that natural alliance between the plough and the loom, the hammer and the harrow. The slave trade. According to him, Urquhart himself is one of the chief agents in the ruin of Turkey, where he had made free trade propaganda in the English interest. The best of it is that Carey, a great Russophile, by the way, wants to prevent the process of separation by that very system of protection which accelerates it. End of footnote. Modern industry, therefore, also, for the first time, conquers for industrial capital the entire home market. Footnote: philanthropic English economists like Mill, Rogers, Goldwin Smith, Fawcett, etc., and liberal manufacturers like John Bright and Co., ask the English landed proprietors, as God asked Cain after Abel, "Where are our thousands of freeholders gone? But where do you come from, then?" From the destruction of those freeholders. Why don't you ask further, where are the independent weavers, spinners, and artisans gone? End of footnote.